In the harsh wilderness of 1880s Montana Territory, where survival meant more than just enduring the bitter cold and unforgiving landscape, one woman's desperate flight for freedom would test every limit of human endurance. Elizabeth Crawford had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to marry a stranger, carrying nothing but hope in her heart and a worn leather satchel containing her few precious belongings. What she found waiting for her at the end of that long journey was not the new life she had dreamed of, but a nightmare that would force her to choose between certain death at the hands of her husband or probable death in the untamed mountains. This is the true story of a woman who refused to surrender her spirit, even when the odds were stacked impossibly against her. It's a tale of brutal survival, unexpected kindness from unlikely sources, and the unbreakable will of someone who discovered that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to give up. In a time when women had few rights and fewer options, Elizabeth's story stands as a testament to the power of human resilience and the bonds that can form between strangers when survival depends on trust. What happened in those frozen peaks would change not just Elizabeth's life, but challenge everything both she and her unlikely rescuer believed about their different worlds. This is her story, raw, authentic, and unforgettable. Elizabeth Crawford pressed her face against the cold window of the train as it pulled into Elkhorn Station, Montana Territory. The November sky hung gray and heavy above the small settlement, promising snow before nightfall. She smoothed the dark blue traveling dress and checked her reflection in the glass. At 23, she still carried the refined bearing of her Boston upbringing, though months of worry had carved shadows beneath her green eyes. The train's whistle pierced the mountain air as it came to a shuddering stop. Elizabeth gathered her carpet bag and the small trunk that contained everything she owned. Through her correspondence with Jacob Whitmore, she had learned he was a prosperous rancher in need of a wife to help run his household. His letters had been brief but polite, describing his property and his desire for an educated woman who could bring culture to the frontier. Elizabeth, left penniless after her father's business collapsed and his subsequent death from heartbreak, had seen no other choice but to answer his advertisement for a bride. The conductor, a weathered man with kind eyes, helped her down from the train. "This your stop, miss? You sure about that?" Elizabeth nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her stomach. "I'm meeting my intended husband." The conductor frowned as he set her trunk on the wooden platform. "Whitmore's place is a fair piece from here. Hope he's coming to fetch you. This ain't no place for a lady alone, especially with winter coming on." As the train pulled away, taking with it her last connection to civilization, Elizabeth stood alone on the platform, scanning the handful of rough-looking men who had come to meet the train. None approached her. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else. Something wild and untamed that made her pull her wool cloak tighter around her shoulders. A heavy hand fell on her shoulder. "You'd be the Crawford woman." Elizabeth turned to find herself face to face with a massive man whose pale blue eyes held no warmth. Jacob Whitmore stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained against his wool coat and hands that looked like they could crush bone. His brown hair hung greasy and unkempt, and several days' worth of whiskers covered his jaw. The smile he wore didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Whitmore." Elizabeth extended her gloved hand, which he took and squeezed just hard enough to make her wince. "I'm pleased to finally meet you. We'll see about that." His laugh held no humor. "You're prettier than I expected." "That's good." "Come on then, we've got a ways to go before dark." He hefted her trunk onto his shoulder, as if it weighed nothing, and started toward a wagon hitched to 2 horses. Elizabeth hurried to keep up with his long strides, already regretting the decision that had brought her to this desolate place. Something about Jacob Whitmore's manner set her nerves on edge, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. The wagon was rough and utilitarian, with no concession to comfort. Jacob threw her trunk in the back and gestured for her to climb up. "Best hold on tight, trail gets rough." As they rolled away from the station, Elizabeth watched the small settlement disappear behind them. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. Rolling hills covered in brown grass, stands of pine and aspen, and in the distance, snow-capped peaks that looked close enough to touch, but were actually many miles away. The vastness of it all made her feel smaller than she ever had in her life. Jacob didn't speak as they traveled, and Elizabeth's attempts at conversation met with grunts or silence. The wagon bounced and lurched over the rutted trail, and after 2 hours her backside was sore and her hands were cramped from gripping the wooden seat. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "How much farther?" she finally asked. "We'll be there when we get there." Jacob replied, without looking at her. Darkness was falling when they finally reached the Whitmore ranch. Elizabeth had expected something modest but respectable, perhaps a neat farmhouse, with a barn and some outbuildings. What she saw in the dim light made her heart sink. The main house was little more than a large cabin, its logs chinked with mud that had cracked and fallen away in places. The roof sagged, and one of the shutters hung askew. A few ramshackle outbuildings clustered nearby, and she could smell the barnyard, even from a distance. Jacob hauled her trunk from the wagon and headed for the house without waiting for her. Elizabeth followed, picking her way carefully across the muddy yard. The door hung slightly open, and warm light spilled out along with the sound of male voices and laughter. Inside, the cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, but no cleaner. 3 men sat around a rough table playing cards and drinking from a bottle that passed between them. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. All conversation stopped when Elizabeth appeared in the doorway. "Boys, meet my new wife," Jacob announced, dropping Elizabeth's trunk with a thud. "Elizabeth, these here are my hands, Bill, Tom, and Red." The 3 men looked her up and down with hungry eyes that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. Bill, a thin man with a popped face and missing teeth, smiled at her in a way that made her want to back toward the door. Tom appeared to be Mexican with a drooping mustache and eyes that held no kindness. Red was aptly named for his shock of orange hair and beard, and when he grinned at her, she noticed his hands were stained with what looked like blood. "Mighty fine-looking woman, Jake," Bill said. "You done good." "I ain't married her yet," Jacob replied. "Elizabeth, put your things in that room there. We'll have the ceremony tomorrow." He pointed to a door off the main room. Elizabeth picked up her carpet bag with trembling hands and walked to the indicated room. It was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and pegs on the wall for hanging clothes. The single window was covered with oiled paper rather than glass, and the whole space smelled of mildew and mice. She sat heavily on the bed, which creaked ominously under her weight. Through the thin walls, she could hear the men talking and laughing in the main room. Snatches of conversation made it clear they were discussing her in terms that made her cheeks burn. She had made a terrible mistake coming here, but what choice did she have? She was hundreds of miles from anywhere, with no money and nowhere to go. A soft knock on the door interrupted her dark thoughts. "Elizabeth, I brought you some supper." She opened the door to find a young Mexican woman holding a plate of beans and cornbread. The woman couldn't have been more than 18, and her dark eyes held a mixture of pity and warning. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered. "I'm Elizabeth Crawford." "Rosa," the woman replied in accented English. "I cook and clean for Mr. Joe Comici, Whitmore." She glanced nervously toward the main room where the men's voices had grown louder. "You should eat. Keep your strength." Something in Rosa's tone made Elizabeth's blood run cold. "Rosa, is there something I should know about Mr. W. Whitmore?" Rosa's eyes darted to the main room again, and she shook her head quickly. But as she turned to go, she whispered so quietly Elizabeth almost missed it. "Be careful, señorita. Be very careful." Elizabeth closed the door and sat back on the bed with the plate balanced on her knees, though she found she had no appetite. Rosa's warning echoed in her mind, along with the memory of Jacob's cold eyes and cruel smile. She thought of her father, who had always protected her, and her comfortable life in Boston that seemed like a dream now. How had she ended up in this nightmare? Outside her room, she could hear the men's voices growing more slurred as the night wore on. Someone mentioned bringing more bottles from the barn, and she heard Jacob's harsh laugh followed by words that made her stomach turn. They were talking about her again, speculating about the wedding night with crude jokes and suggestions that left no doubt about what kind of man she was expected to marry. Elizabeth lay down fully clothed on the lumpy mattress, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Through the walls, she could hear everything. Every crude comment, every burst of drunken laughter, every detail of Jacob's plans for her. When she heard him say he planned to keep her in line the same way he had his previous wife, her blood turned to ice. "What happened to your previous wife?" one of the men asked. "She learned to mind her manners eventually," Jacob replied with another laugh. "Took some teaching, but she got the message. This one will too." Elizabeth pressed her face into the pillow to muffle the sob that escaped her lips. She was trapped in the middle of nowhere with a man who spoke casually about violence toward women, and tomorrow she was supposed to marry him. The train wouldn't return for weeks, and even if it did, she had no money for a ticket back to Boston. As the hours passed and the men finally stumbled off to their bunks, Elizabeth lay awake staring at the ceiling. She could hear Jacob moving around in the main room, and every creak of the floorboards made her tense. When his heavy footsteps approached her door, she held her breath and waited. The door handle turned slowly, and she saw his shadow fill the doorway. "Tomorrow you'll be my wife," he said quietly, his voice thick with drink. "You'll do what I say, when I say it, without question." "You understand me, Elizabeth?" She didn't answer, hoping he would think she was asleep. After a long moment, he chuckled and closed the door. She heard him moving toward what must be his own room, but sleep remained elusive. Every sound made her jump, and she spent the night planning ways to escape from a place that seemed to offer no escape at all. When dawn finally broke, painting the oiled paper window with grey light, Elizabeth knew she faced the most important decision of her life. She could go through with the marriage and hope that Jacob would treat her better than his words suggested, or she could try to run. Neither choice offered much hope for survival. But one thing was certain. She could not and would not stay here to become another victim of Jacob Whitmore's particular brand of matrimony. The sound of Rosa moving around in the kitchen told her the household was waking up. Soon Jacob would expect her to emerge and prepare for their wedding ceremony. Elizabeth sat up on the edge of the bed and began making plans that would either save her life or end it. Either way, she refused to surrender her dignity and spirit to a man who saw her as property to be owned and controlled. The morning of what was supposed to be her wedding day had arrived, but Elizabeth Crawford was about to make a choice that would change everything. The Indian moved through the darkness with an assurance that seemed impossible to Elizabeth, who could barely see her own hands in front of her face. He led her away from the canyon rim and deeper into the forest, following what might have been a game trail, but looked like pathless wilderness to her untrained eyes. Behind them, Jacob's furious shouts grew fainter, but never disappeared entirely. "What's your name?" Elizabeth whispered during a brief pause, as her guide checked their back trail. "Joseph," he replied quietly. "English name. Sioux name is Mato Najin Standing Bear. I'm Elizabeth Crawford." Joseph nodded and started moving again. "We must cross water before dawn. He will bring more men when sun comes." They descended into the canyon through a route Elizabeth would never have found on her own, a narrow cleft in the rocks that switched back down the steep wall like a giant staircase. Joseph moved ahead of her, occasionally reaching back to steady her when loose stones shifted under her feet. The sound of the river grew louder as they descended, until it became a roar that would mask any noise they made. At the bottom, the river proved to be even more formidable than it had appeared from above. The current ran swift and dark, and ice had formed along the edges where the water moved more slowly. Joseph studied the crossing for several minutes, then began removing his pack and weapons. "Water is cold," he said matter-of-factly. "We must move fast." Elizabeth stared at the rushing torrent in horror. "I can't swim in that. I'll drown." "You will freeze if we stay here," Joseph replied. "Bad man will find trail by morning." As if to emphasize his point, a distant shout echoed down from the canyon rim. Jacob and his men were still searching, and Elizabeth realized that the Indian was right. They had to cross the river or be trapped against it when their pursuers found the trail. Joseph removed a coil of rope from his pack and tied one end around his waist. "Hold on to me," he instructed. "Do not let go, no matter what happens." Elizabeth tied the other end of the rope around her own waist with trembling fingers. The thought of entering that icy water terrified her, almost as much as the thought of Jacob catching them. But she had come too far to give up now. Joseph waded into the river first, testing each step carefully. The water reached his knees, then his waist, then his chest. Elizabeth followed, gasping as the cold hit her like a physical blow. Within seconds, she lost all feeling in her legs, and the current threatened to sweep her downstream, despite Joseph's steady progress. Halfway across, disaster struck. Elizabeth stepped on a moss-covered rock that rolled under her weight, and she went down hard. The current immediately caught her and yanked her downstream, the rope snapping taut around her waist. The sudden jerk pulled Joseph off balance, and for a terrifying moment, both of them were at the mercy of the rushing water. Joseph managed to regain his footing and began hauling her back against the current, but Elizabeth was drowning in her heavy skirts and cloak. Water filled her mouth and nose, and the cold was so intense it felt like being stabbed with knives. She fought to keep her head above water while Joseph pulled steadily on the rope, his feet braced against the river bottom. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Joseph dragged her to the far shore and hauled her up onto the rocky bank. Elizabeth collapsed, coughing up river water and shaking so violently she couldn't speak. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and ice began forming on her wet clothes almost immediately. "Must move," Joseph said urgently, "or you die from cold." He pulled her to her feet and began running his hands roughly over her arms and shoulders, trying to restore circulation. Elizabeth was too cold and exhausted to feel embarrassed by the intimate contact. She could barely stand, let alone walk. But Joseph half carried her away from the river and up another game trail that climbed the opposite canyon wall. The next few hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and cold. Joseph pushed them hard, stopping only occasionally to let Elizabeth rest and to check their back trail. He shared his water and dried meat with her, though she could barely force herself to eat. Her wet clothes had frozen stiff, making each step an ordeal. But the alternative was to stop moving and die. As dawn approached, they reached what appeared to be solid wilderness, a high plateau covered with pine forest and broken by rocky outcroppings. Joseph led her to a cave hidden behind a screen of boulders and deadfall timber. Inside, the cave extended back into the mountain far enough to provide shelter while remaining invisible from outside. "We rest here," Joseph said, dropping his pack with evident relief. Elizabeth collapsed onto the sandy floor of the cave, too exhausted to care about anything except stopping. Her whole body ached. Her clothes were still damp and cold, and she had never been so tired in her life. Joseph quickly gathered dry wood and built a small fire near the cave entrance, where the smoke would dissipate before reaching the outside air. As warmth began to fill the cave, Elizabeth felt her frozen body slowly coming back to life. The feeling was almost as painful as the cold had been, but gradually her shaking subsided and she could think clearly again. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as Joseph tended the fire. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke without looking at her. "I had wife once. White soldiers took her, said she was their prisoner. When I found her, she was—" He paused, staring into the flames. "She was broken. Like you would be broken by bad man." Elizabeth felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm sorry." Joseph nodded. "She died that winter. Could not eat, could not sleep. Just died." He looked directly at Elizabeth then. "I could not save her. Maybe I save you." They sat in silence as the fire crackled and the cave gradually warmed. Elizabeth tried to process everything that had happened, her escape, the terrifying river crossing, and now finding herself alone with a man whose people were supposed to be her enemies. Yet Joseph had risked his life to help her, while her own countrymen had been ready to abuse and control her. "Where will we go?" she asked eventually. "North," Joseph replied. "To my people's winter camp. They will decide what to do with you." Will I be safe there?" Joseph considered the question seriously. "Some will not trust you. White woman brings trouble. But my uncle is chief. He is wise man. He will listen." Elizabeth nodded, though the prospect of walking into a Sioux camp filled her with anxiety. Still, it seemed like her only option. She certainly couldn't return to civilization and risk Jacob finding her. And she had no skills for surviving alone in the wilderness. "How long will it take to reach your people?" she asked. 5 days walking, maybe 6. If weather holds. Joseph glanced toward the cave entrance, where grey morning light was beginning to filter in. "But first, we see if Bad Man follows." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of men's voices echoed across the plateau. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice as she recognized Jacob's voice among them, along with at least 2 others. They had somehow managed to cross the river and track them to this place. "How is that possible?" Elizabeth whispered. Joseph's face was grim as he began scattering the fire. "He knows this country better than I thought. Or he has Indian tracker with him." The voices were getting closer, and Elizabeth could make out words now. Jacob was furious, cursing her and swearing vengeance on anyone who helped her. One of the other men was suggesting they give up the chase, saying no woman was worth this much trouble. Jacob's response made Elizabeth's skin crawl. "She's my property now, and I don't let anyone steal what's mine," he snarled. "We'll find her, and when we do, she'll wish she'd never been born." Joseph quickly packed their few belongings and slung his rifle over his shoulder. "Back of cave goes deep," he whispered. "We hide until they pass." They crept toward the rear of the cave, where the ceiling dropped low and the passage narrowed to barely shoulder width. Elizabeth had to crawl on her hands and knees, feeling her way in complete darkness, while Joseph moved silently ahead of her. The rock was cold and damp, and she tried not to think about what might be living in the deeper recesses of the cave. They had barely reached a wider chamber when footsteps and voices echoed from the cave entrance. Elizabeth pressed her face against the cold stone and held her breath, praying that Jacob wouldn't think to search the cave thoroughly. "Tracks lead this way," a voice she didn't recognize said. "Recent ones. Could be anybody," another man replied. "Lots of folks use these caves." "Could be her," Jacob said grimly. "Tom, you check inside. Bill and me will look around outside. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps approached. A dim glow appeared in the passage as someone brought a torch into the cave. She could hear him moving around, examining the fire site, looking for signs of recent occupation. Beside her, Joseph had drawn his knife and was tense to fight if necessary. Elizabeth realized that if they were discovered, he would try to defend her against 3 armed men, and they would both die in this dark hole in the ground. The injustice of it all, that this good man might die because she had been foolish enough to answer a mail-order bride advertisement, made her want to weep. The torchlight grew brighter as the searcher moved deeper into the cave. Elizabeth could see the glow reflecting off the rock walls of their hiding place, and she knew discovery was only moments away. She closed her eyes and prepared for the worst. Then, miraculously, the light began to fade. "Nothing here but old ashes," the searcher called out. If they were here, they moved on. "Check the back," Jacob's voice commanded from outside. I did. Goes back maybe 20 feet and then narrows down too tight for anything bigger than a rabbit. Nobody's hiding back there. Elizabeth nearly sobbed with relief. The searcher had apparently missed the narrow passage that led to their deeper hiding place. A few more minutes of tense silence, and then the voices began to fade as the search party moved on across the plateau. They waited in the darkness for what felt like hours before Joseph finally whispered that it was safe to move. Crawling back to the main cave felt like emerging from a tomb, and Elizabeth was pathetically grateful to see daylight again, even filtered through the cave entrance. "They will keep searching," Joseph said quietly. "We cannot stay here." Elizabeth nodded, though she felt like she could sleep for a week. The thought of more walking, more running, more fear was almost overwhelming. But the alternative was worse. "How did they track us across the river?" she asked. Joseph's expression was troubled. "Tom is good tracker. Mexican, but learned from Apache. He sees signs others miss. That meant Jacob's pursuit would be relentless and professional. Elizabeth had hoped that crossing the river would be enough to throw them off the trail, but clearly she had underestimated her enemy's determination and resources. "Can we reach your people before they catch us?" "Maybe," Joseph replied, but his tone was not encouraging. "We travel fast, stay ahead of them. But they have horses somewhere. We only have legs." As they prepared to leave the cave, Elizabeth realized that her ordeal was far from over. She was being hunted through some of the most unforgiving wilderness in North America by a man who saw her as property to be reclaimed. Her only protection was a Sioux warrior who had his own reasons for distrusting white people. But as she followed Joseph out of the cave and back into the vast Montana wilderness, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Boston: hope. She was no longer alone. And for the first time since stepping off that train, she had an ally who seemed genuinely committed to helping her reach safety. The journey to the Sioux winter camp would test every ounce of strength and courage she possessed, but she was no longer the frightened mail-order bride who had fled Jacob Whitmore's ranch. The mountains were changing her, stripping away everything soft and civilized, and revealing something harder underneath. She would need every bit of that newfound strength for what lay ahead. The next 3 days became a nightmare of constant movement, bitter cold, and the ever-present fear of capture. Joseph pushed them hard, moving before dawn and not stopping until well after dark. They traveled through country so rough and remote that Elizabeth wondered if any white person had ever seen it before. Pine forests gave way to rocky highlands, which descended into hidden valleys filled with aspen groves, whose golden leaves carpeted the ground like scattered coins. Joseph seemed to know every game trail, every water source, every place where they could find shelter when the mountain storm struck with sudden fury. Elizabeth learned to walk in his footsteps exactly, to avoid breaking twigs or disturbing stones that might leave sign for their pursuers. She discovered muscles she never knew she had, and found reserves of endurance that surprised even herself. On the second day, they encountered the first serious storm. Snow began falling just after noon, first as scattered flakes that melted on contact, then as a steady curtain that reduced visibility to mere yards. The temperature plummeted and the wind began to howl through the peaks with a sound like tormented spirits. "We must find shelter," Joseph shouted over the wind. "This storm will last a long time." They took refuge in a grove of ancient pines whose massive trunks created a natural windbreak. Joseph showed Elizabeth how to pile pine needles and dead branches to create an insulated nest, and they huddled together under his buffalo robe while the storm raged around them. Elizabeth had never been so close to a man who wasn't her father, but survival trumped propriety, and she was grateful for the warmth of another human body. "Tell me about your people," she said during one of the brief lulls in the wind. Joseph was quiet for a moment, staring out at the swirling snow. We are Lakota Sioux. My band follows Chief Red Eagle, my mother's brother. We winter in valley north of here, protected from worse storms. In summer, we follow buffalo herds across Great Plains. Do you hate white people? Elizabeth asked, surprising herself with her directness. Some, Joseph replied honestly. White soldiers killed many of my people, took our lands, drove away buffalo, put children in schools where they cannot speak our language. He looked at her sideways. But not all white people are soldiers. Not all are bad. How can you tell the difference? Same way you tell difference between good and bad among your people. By their actions, not their skin. Elizabeth considered this as the storm continued to batter their fragile shelter. What will happen when we reach your camp? Council will decide, Joseph said. Some will say you bring trouble, that white woman should be sent away. Others will say you deserve protection because you are guest and I gave my word. And if they decide to send me away? Joseph's jaw tightened. Then I will escort you to trading post at Fort Benton. But it is long journey, and winter comes soon. The prospect of traveling even farther into the wilderness filled Elizabeth with dread, but she tried not to let it show. She had placed her trust in this man, and worrying about events beyond her control would serve no purpose. The storm lasted 2 days, during which they survived on dried meat and melted snow. Elizabeth learned to appreciate simple things she had always taken for granted: dry clothes, a warm fire, food that didn't require chewing like leather. When the snow finally stopped and they emerged from their shelter, the world had been transformed into a crystalline wonderland of impossible beauty. But beauty brought its own dangers. The fresh snow made their tracks painfully obvious to anyone following, and the cold was intense enough to kill quickly if they weren't careful. Joseph fashioned crude snowshoes from pine branches and leather strips, which helped them move across the deeper drifts, but slowed their progress considerably. On the 4th day, they had their closest call yet. They were crossing an open meadow when Joseph suddenly grabbed Elizabeth's arm and pulled her down behind a fallen log. Peering over the bark, she could see 3 riders moving along a ridge perhaps half a mile away. Even at that distance, she recognized Jacob's massive silhouette. "How did they get ahead of us?" she whispered. "They know where we go," Joseph replied grimly. Someone told them about winter camp. The realization that they were walking into a trap hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. If Jacob knew about the Sioux camp, he could simply wait for them there. Worse, he might attack the camp if he thought the Indians were harboring his property. "We can't lead him to your people," Elizabeth said. "He'll blame them for helping me." Joseph nodded, his face set in hard lines. "We change direction. Go west toward mountains. But that's away from safety, isn't it?" "Yes, but better than bringing war to my people." They waited until the riders disappeared over the ridge, then struck off toward the most forbidding peaks Elizabeth had yet seen. These mountains looked like the spine of the world, jagged, snow-covered summits that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. The very sight of them made her feel small and insignificant. As they climbed higher, the air grew thin enough to make every breath an effort. Elizabeth's lungs burned, and her heart pounded from the exertion. Several times she had to stop and rest, leaning against trees until her vision cleared and the dizziness passed. Joseph waited patiently for her, though she could see the worry in his eyes. They were running out of time and options. That night they sheltered in a crack between 2 massive boulders, barely wide enough for both of them to lie down. There was no possibility of a fire at this altitude with the wind howling like a living thing, so they pressed together under the buffalo robe and tried to share what little body heat they had. "I'm going to die up here, aren't I?" Elizabeth said quietly. "Maybe we both die," Joseph replied with typical Indian honesty. "But we die free." Elizabeth found unexpected comfort in those words. Whatever happened, she had chosen her own fate rather than submitting to Jacob's control. If she froze to death in these mountains, at least she would die with her dignity intact. But Joseph wasn't ready to give up. The next morning, he led her to a vantage point that offered a view back the way they had come. Far below, they could see smoke from several campfires. Jacob and his men had made camp and were apparently settling in for an extended search. "They wait for us to come down," Joseph observed. "Think we cannot survive up here." "Can we?" Joseph studied the peaks above them, calculating distances and weather signs with the skill of a man born to this country. "There is pass," he said finally. "Very high, very dangerous. But it leads to other valley, away from them. How dangerous! People die crossing it, even in good weather." "In winter," he shrugged eloquently. Elizabeth looked at the pass he indicated, a narrow notch between two peaks that looked impossibly high and remote. The very thought of attempting such a crossing in winter weather seemed like suicide, but the alternative was capture, and she had already decided she would rather die than return to Jacob Whitmore. How long to reach it? 2 days climbing, if weather holds. They spent that day resting and preparing for what Joseph frankly admitted might be their last journey. He showed Elizabeth how to wrap her feet in strips of hide to prevent frostbite, how to recognize the signs of altitude sickness, and how to walk in snow so deep it sometimes reached their waists. That evening, as they shared what might be their last meal together, Joseph told her more about his life. He had been married young to a woman from another band, part of an alliance between chiefs. She had been beautiful and kind, but she had never learned to love him. And their marriage had been more political than personal. When soldiers took her, I thought maybe it was punishment for not being better husband, he said quietly. Now I think maybe Great Spirit brought her suffering so I would understand yours. You think your God wanted her to die so you could save me? I think all things connected. Pain leads to understanding, understanding leads to compassion. Maybe her death gives meaning if it helps you live. Elizabeth had never heard anyone talk about tragedy and loss in such terms. In Boston, suffering was generally viewed as something to be avoided or endured, not as a potential source of wisdom or connection to others. The idea that pain might have purpose beyond mere punishment was foreign, but oddly comforting. They started for the pass before dawn, climbing through snow that grew deeper and more treacherous with every step. The wind at this altitude was constant and bitter, driving ice crystals that stung exposed skin like needles. Elizabeth's world shrank to the next step, the next breath, the next moment of not falling or freezing. By midday, they were above the tree line, moving across expanses of rock and snow that belonged more to the realm of eagles than humans. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind and the crunch of their snowshoes. Several times, they had to rope themselves together to cross slopes where a single misstep would mean a fall of hundreds of feet. As afternoon wore towards evening, they reached the base of the pass itself. It looked even more forbidding up close, a narrow couloir that climbed steeply between walls of stone and ice. The wind funneled through it with tremendous force, and Elizabeth could see places where avalanches had swept down from the peaks above. Tomorrow we cross, Joseph said, pitching their shelter behind a boulder that offered some protection from the wind. Tonight we rest and prepare. Elizabeth nodded, though she doubted she would sleep much. They were about to attempt something that might kill them both, and she was terrified. But she was also proud of how far she had come. The pampered Boston lady who had stepped off the train a week ago could never have survived what she had already endured. As she lay beside Joseph under the buffalo robe, listening to the wind howl through the peaks above them, Elizabeth realized that whatever happened tomorrow, she had already won something important. She had discovered strength she never knew she possessed, had learned to trust someone completely different from herself, and had chosen dignity over safety. The past loomed above them in the darkness, waiting to test everything they had learned about survival, courage, and the bonds that could form between strangers when their lives depended on each other. Elizabeth closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for the most dangerous day of her life. But first, she had to survive the night. Dawn broke clear and bitterly cold, with a wind that cut through their makeshift shelter like a blade. Elizabeth woke to find frost on her eyelashes and ice crystals covering the inside of the buffalo robe, where their breath had frozen during the night. Her entire body ached from sleeping on the rocky ground. But she was alive and ready to face whatever the day might bring. Joseph was already awake, studying the pass above them with the intense concentration of a man whose life depended on reading the mountain's moods correctly. The couloir looked even more daunting in daylight, a steep, narrow gash that disappeared into the clouds somewhere far above their heads. Weather is good for crossing, he said quietly. No new snow, wind from south. But we must move fast. Storm comes tomorrow, maybe tonight. Elizabeth could see no sign of approaching weather, but she had learned to trust Joseph's ability to read signs she couldn't even perceive. If he said a storm was coming, then they had perhaps one day to make it over the pass and down to safety on the other side. They ate the last of their dried meat and drank melted snow that tasted of stone and sky. Joseph checked their rope and climbing equipment with methodical care, explaining each piece to Elizabeth and how they would use it in the treacherous climb ahead. Most dangerous part is avalanche zone, he said, pointing to a section of the pass where the snow lay deep and unstable between towering rock walls. We must cross quickly and quietly. No talking, no sudden movements. One wrong step could bring whole mountain down on us. Elizabeth nodded. though the thought of triggering an avalanche that would bury them both alive made her stomach clench with fear. She had read about such things in newspaper accounts of alpine disasters, but the reality of facing that danger herself was almost overwhelming. They roped themselves together with Joseph leading, then began the ascent into the couloir. The first few hundred feet were manageable, though steep, but as they climbed higher, the route became increasingly treacherous. The snow was wind-packed and slippery, requiring careful placement of each step. Several times Elizabeth slipped and would have fallen if not for the rope connecting her to Joseph's steady progress. The altitude began to affect her seriously as they climbed higher. Her head pounded, her vision blurred periodically, and she felt nauseated despite having eaten almost nothing. Joseph called frequent rest stops, but each pause made it harder to force her protesting body back into motion. Halfway up the pass, they reached the avalanche zone Joseph had warned her about. The couloir widened here into a broad bowl where unstable snow had accumulated to tremendous depth. Looking up, Elizabeth could see cornices of wind-blown snow hanging precariously from the rock faces above, any one of which could break loose and trigger a slide that would sweep them away like insects. Joseph gestured for absolute silence as they began crossing the danger zone. Each step had to be placed with infinite care, and they moved with the painful slowness of people walking through a minefield. The only sounds were their labored breathing and the occasional distant crack of ice settling somewhere in the heights above. They were 3/4 of the way across when disaster struck. Elizabeth, dizzy from altitude and exhaustion, placed her foot on what looked like solid snow. The crust broke through, and her leg plunged into a hidden crevasse. The sudden jolt threw her off balance, and she fell backward with a startled cry that echoed off the surrounding walls like a gunshot. For a moment, that lasted forever. They both waited for the mountain's response. Then, with a sound like distant thunder, the snow above them began to move. "Run!" Joseph shouted, abandoning all pretense of stealth. They plunged across the remaining distance toward the far side of the bowl, as the avalanche built momentum behind them. Elizabeth had never moved so fast in her life, driven by pure terror and Joseph's steady pull on the rope. The roar grew louder, and she could feel the ground beginning to vibrate beneath her feet as thousands of tons of snow and ice gathered speed. They reached the relative safety of a rock outcropping just as the avalanche thundered past, filling the air with a choking cloud of snow dust that reduced visibility to zero. Elizabeth pressed herself against the rock wall and tried to breathe while the mountain's fury raged around them. When the roar finally faded and the dust settled, she looked back to see that their tracks had been completely obliterated. The entire avalanche zone had been scoured clean, leaving only blue ice and scattered boulders. "We live," Joseph said with evident surprise, as if he hadn't quite believed they would make it. Elizabeth nodded, though she was shaking so violently from fear and adrenaline that she could barely stand. They had survived, but only barely, and the most difficult part of the climb still lay ahead. The final approach to the pass required technical climbing over nearly vertical rock faces glazed with ice. Joseph went first, chopping handholds with a small axe and securing the rope so Elizabeth could follow. Her soft Boston hands, already cracked and bleeding from days of rough travel, were soon torn raw by the sharp rock and freezing metal. But gradually, impossibly, they made progress. Step by agonizing step, they climbed towards the narrow notch that marked the top of the pass. Elizabeth's world shrank to the next handhold, the next breath, the burning ache in her arms and legs that meant she was still alive and fighting. Just as her strength was about to give out completely, she heard Joseph's voice from above. "Elizabeth, come see." She forced herself up the last few feet and emerged onto the narrow saddle that marked the summit of the pass. What she saw there made her forget all about the pain and exhaustion. Spread out below them on the western side was a vista of such beauty, it took her breath away. The mountains fell away in wave after wave of snow-covered peaks, their summits glowing pink and gold in the afternoon sun. Between them lay hidden valleys filled with dark forests, and in the distance she could see what looked like a great river winding through the foothills toward the western horizon. "Canada," Joseph said, pointing toward the river. 2 days walking to Hudson Bay Company Post. They will help you." Elizabeth stared at the promised land spread out before them. After everything they had endured, safety was finally within reach. But as she looked at Joseph, she realized that reaching the trading post would mean the end of their partnership. And the thought filled her with unexpected sadness. "What will you do?" she asked. "Go back to my people. Tell them what happened, warn them about bad men who might come looking for you. Will I ever see you again?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "Our paths cross for reason," he said finally. "Great Spirit brought us together when you needed help, when I needed to understand my wife's suffering. Now you are safe, and I am healed. Maybe that is enough." They began the descent toward the western valleys as the sun moved lower in the sky. The route was less technically difficult than the ascent had been, but the snow was deep, and they were both exhausted from their ordeal at altitude. Several times Elizabeth stumbled and fell, and Joseph had to help her back to her feet. As evening approached, they made camp in a grove of pine trees beside a small stream that ran clear and cold from some hidden spring. Joseph caught fish with his bare hands using techniques Elizabeth had never imagined, and they cooked their first hot meal in days over a small fire that felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. "Tell me about Boston," Joseph said as they ate. Elizabeth found herself describing her former life as if it belonged to someone else entirely. The elegant townhouse where she had grown up, the formal dinners and social calls, the strict rules that governed every aspect of a lady's behavior, it all seemed impossibly distant and irrelevant now. The woman who had lived that life would never have survived what she had just endured. "Do you miss it?" Joseph asked. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "I miss my father. I miss feeling safe and warm. But I don't miss being helpless, having every decision made for me by someone else." She looked at her torn and dirty hands, the hands of someone who had learned to fight for survival. "I'm not the same person I was when I got off that train." "Good," Joseph said. "That person would have died. This person lives." The next day brought easier traveling as they descended into more hospitable country. The trees were larger here, providing better shelter, and they encountered game trails that spoke of abundant wildlife. Elizabeth's spirits rose with every mile that separated them from the dangerous heights they had crossed. Late in the afternoon, they crested a ridge and saw smoke rising from a valley below. Joseph studied it through a small telescope he carried, then nodded with satisfaction. "Trading post, you are safe now." They descended toward the settlement as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The trading post consisted of several log buildings surrounded by a stockade fence, with corrals holding horses and a few cattle. To Elizabeth, it looked like paradise. The trader who came out to meet them was a grizzled Scotsman named MacLeod, who spoke with Joseph in a mixture of English and Sioux. After hearing their story, he shook his head in amazement and invited them both inside for a hot meal and warm beds. "You're lucky to be alive, lass," he told Elizabeth as his Indian wife fussed over her torn clothes and injuries. "That pass has killed better travelers than most." And in winter, he shook his head again. Over the next few days, Elizabeth recovered her strength, while MacLeod made arrangements for her journey to more civilized parts of Canada. A supply train was heading to Fort Calgary in 2 weeks, and she could travel with them in relative safety. From there, she could take the new railroad back east or continue west to the Pacific coast. The choice would be hers. On the morning Joseph was to return to his own people, Elizabeth walked with him to the edge of the settlement. They stood together in comfortable silence, looking back toward the mountains they had crossed together. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally. "You already did," Joseph replied. "You trusted me when you had no reason to trust. You showed courage when you could have given up. You reminded me that not all white people are enemies, and you saved my life in more ways than one." Joseph smiled, the first truly relaxed smile she had seen from him. "We saved each other, I think." He mounted his horse and gathered the reins, then looked down at her one last time. "What will you do now?" Elizabeth thought about the question, realizing that for the first time in her life, she truly had choices to make. She could return to Boston and try to rebuild her old life, or she could continue west and see what opportunities the frontier might offer to a woman who had learned she was stronger than she ever imagined. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But whatever I choose, it will be my choice." Joseph nodded approvingly. "That is all any person can ask for, the right to choose their own path." He rode away toward the eastern mountains, and Elizabeth watched until he disappeared among the trees. She would never forget the man who had risked everything to help a stranger, who had shown her what true courage looked like, and who had given her the greatest gift possible, her freedom. 6 months later, Elizabeth Crawford opened a small school in the growing town of Calgary, teaching the children of miners, ranchers, and traders. She never married, though she received several proposals from respectable men who admired her independence and strength. She had learned the difference between a partnership built on mutual respect and a relationship based on control and possession. Sometimes, on clear winter days, when the mountains were visible from her schoolhouse window, she would think about Joseph and wonder if he had found peace among his people. She hoped he had, and she hoped he knew that her new life was built on the foundation of courage and self-reliance he had helped her discover during their journey through the high passes. Jacob Whitmore never found her trail after they crossed the mountain pass. Some said he searched for months before finally giving up and returning to his ranch, where Rosa had disappeared one night, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and a small silver cross. Others claimed he had died in the mountains during his obsessive pursuit, though his body was never found. Elizabeth preferred not to speculate about his fate. She had escaped his control and built a life on her own terms, and that was victory enough. The mail-order bride who had fled into the wilderness had died in those mountains, and from her ashes had emerged someone stronger, wiser, and truly free. In the end, that transformation was worth every moment of terror, every step through the snow, and every night spent wondering if she would live to see another dawn. Freedom, she had learned, was not something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something that had to be claimed, defended, and earned through the courage to risk everything for the right to choose your own destiny. The mountains had taught her that lesson, and she would never forget it.